Hello, hello. Today I have a review of Journey to Mars, the Wonderful World. Its beauty and splendor, its mighty races and kingdoms, its final doom, by Gustavus W. Pope, a 1894 work. It's the early 1890s, and American Antarctic sailor and explorer Lieutenant Frederick Hamilton and his Maori companion are rescued by Martian explorers and taken by ethervolt cars, magnetic cars, along the magnetic currents to Mars, where which is a much more ancient planet in its biome and its cultures. And it's all kind of feudal, yet it's all kind of feudal in nature. This is kings and princes and kingdoms is what seems to populate this highly densely populated world. Now Hamilton gets the royal carpet treatment because he has saved one of the first acts he has when he the Martians come upon him, is he saves one of the great crown princes of this land, Prince Altafora. And so he gets the red carpet treatment. He ends up falling in love with Altafora's sister, the beautiful Princess Sulima. There are tons and tons of scientific inventions. A lot of this coming from both the brilliant scientist Asterion, who has invented these ethervolt cars that are able to travel the vast distances of space at amazing speeds. And Hamilton himself, who kind of loves telling in minute detail about every single fact, whether it's biological, mineralogical, sociological. This very much reads as a explorer's account of these worlds, and somebody who seems to be jotting down every detail because it might be important later. Now there is also kind of deep into this book. It's kind of like it's over 500 pages long. This book. There is an arrogant, cowardly, or rival prince, the Prince Diabajar of a rival kingdom, who has designs on the beautiful Sulima, and Hamilton gets caught up in the intrigue. There's a duel. There is escape from prisons. There is prophecies in this book. There is slightly mystical stuff here of things beyond science, even in here. But in the end, all this gets kind of dwarfed by great cosmological events that also happen, which further fascinate Hamilton and obviously the author Pope. I picked up this book because I had heard about it in my kind of research for the Edgar Rice Burroughs Barsoom series. The Princess of Mars was published in 1917, actually, it was published as a book in 1917, it was published as stories in 1912, and this was said to be one of the influences on Edgar Rice Burroughs. And it does share a lot of stuff with Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom Mars novels. There's a frame story that starts this. In this case, there's a mysterious casket that gets delivered to a fellow at the beginning that opens it and contains Hamilton's journal accounts of his voyage to Mars. There's races of different colors on Mars. There's yellow, blue, red. There's not as much made of the races, even though we do get into, again, with books, it seems, in this period, racial theories. It's a feudal society again, as we said, again with the princesses, though this is not a book that is as kind of going to be interested in doing royal daring do's with princesses and stuff like that, even though there is one duel in the book. Interestingly enough, again, there's this kind of reoccurring theme of the doomed, dying ancient planet, kind of decadent and fallen races. Both Edgar Rice Burroughs and another fellow that I read, Edwin Lester Arnold and his Gulliver of Mars, which is published in 1905, all kind of centered around this idea of this is the dying planet. There's this term in science fiction of the planetary romances, and a part of this romance, at least amongst these three fellows, is the idea of a fallen civilizations, of sharing that thing of like a decay. When it's interesting, like it's that this time where we're getting the kind of the ebbing of the British Empire, of the kind of all these English speaking authors. We're getting the fall of this empire, and there's all this talk of how we're having a decay of the of empire, and we're having people being like, it's not as good as the old days, kind of stuff, coming from bunches of white folks who held domination over people of other races and other cultures just earlier in this time. So it's an interesting kind of, yet again, kind of that kind of reflection of what is going on, and maybe also just the idea of a feudal kind of setup for things, of there being great kings kind of holding sway over their subjects. It's like that kind of resonates with this kind of the fall of empire thing. Now, the big thing with this is big shift from Edgar Rice Burroughs is, while Edgar Rice Burroughs was science fantasy, I think I talked a lot about how his most the thing that probably kind of most reflects on Edgar Rice Burroughs in our modern day is something like Star Wars. Yes, it's out in space, but it's fantasy. These are knights and evil villains, and they're jousting. Well, maybe not so much the now most recent stuff, but it's still, we're not really interested in the science. We're not really interested in how things go, except maybe fuel and certain science Star Wars movies that I won't mention here. Pope is actually more like his exact. It seems like he is more like his exact contemporary, Jules Verne. Jules Verne was born in 1828, as was Augustus W. Pope, both born in 1828, and both died within a couple of years ago. And Jules Verne, from my ignorant thing, because I actually haven't read a lot of Jules Verne, and I think what I did was probably the butchered stuff, is like, these are guys who are much more interested in science. Their contemporaries today are the hard science guys in science fiction, where they're really interested in working out all the nuts and bolts of extrapolating actual science of today and trying to kind of push it forward and apply ideas. That is very much, you get the sense that that's where Pope is coming from as an author. He's really, really interested in the science of his own day and stuff like that. Hamilton is an exhaustive, sometimes exhausting narrator who puts forward, whole catalogs of stuff on flora and fauna and geology and science theory and geography and cosmology, and not to mention just sort of all the kind of the political organizations, and how cities are set out. And some of the times I just wanted to kind of grab them and shake them and go, you realize this isn't real. You do not have to be giving me this much detail. But that said, he is doing what a hard science fiction guy would do. He's giving you lots of science, and there's lots of old science here. Stuff like the space is filled with ether, this medium that is what is necessary to conduct light through space. You go into you can go fall down rabbit holes of like, why did we need ether filling space? It's like, well, so light, it could conduct light across way. How did the light from the sun get to the earth if it was a void? If light is a wave, now we get into the light and particle thing. So, but yeah, you can go down all that sort of idea. The idea of electromagnetic currents, I think, is Maxwell, is someone who is putting forward things like 1850s or 1860s is putting forward stuff on electromagnetism. So you have spaceships powered by following electromagnetic currents across stuff. So it's Pope here is using the science of his own day to create a science fiction story. I mean, doing that science fiction sci-fi thing of you extrapolate from the science. there's actually an interesting thing in here also of instantaneous communication. This gets invented during the novel, probably is just a sort of, it's like narrative convenience for Pope, but it's called AMA, and it's simultaneous communication, where basically one motion here immediately gets reflected here. It reminds me of the Ansible, which is a concept that was coined by Ursula K. Le Guin, in the idea of like, well, if you can have a galactic empire, it would be impossible if you didn't have instantaneous or near instantaneous communication across vast amounts of time. And this is vast amounts of space. And this seems to be the sort of the same idea. So you can get that ideas of, kind of the cool old science getting used to construct this world. That said, like in Burroughs, like in Edwin Lester Arnold, you also get the kind of the less appealing ideas. There is the purity of the races. There is much made that there were Pluto was used to have life in it, and the refugees came to Mars, and some of those Plutonians seduced Martians, and there was a mixing of races, which is said to be sort of one of the sources of the venality and corruption of Prince Diovajar's country and him himself, of that they have been contaminated by mixing of the races, which is, this is the especially you think about this is an American writer writing in the late 1890s. In the 1890s, that is, the grossest kind of racist, kind of white purity kind of rhetoric, clothed in a science fiction story. And indeed, at the very latest parts of the novel, there is a scene of them returning to Earth where a horde of Asian people is depicted attacking some good white Christian Americans, and basically depicted as subhuman. In that there's very kind of clear ideas of race and ugly stereotypes that do come up in this book. These books are great time capsules for the horrendous as well as the kind of just fascinating stuff, and fascinatingly horrendous, and just that sort of thing is always going to interest me as somebody who's interested in kind of the intellectual history of Western culture, just how ugly it can also be. It's strange. The Martians are also just a strangely Christian lot. It's very much like, did Christ come visit Mars before it visited Earth? Because they very much are talking about kind of Christian values. There's Hamilton is enjoined to trust in God, and they quickly learn all the Christian stories so that they can quote them back to Hamilton in this story. So we get that as well. We also get the definite notion that Hamilton and the Martians are all creationists. They all believe that, oh yes, there's evolution, but there was an author to the evolution. It's still, very much, you could have a hard science fiction novel with in this time where still we have creationist values in there as kind of a very accepted and kind of just matter of fact thing in the novel, which is really interesting to see. And attitudes towards animals. There's at one point a ship gets lodged in a whale, and it's like, oh, we'll give it indigestion. So they freaking shoot the gun straight down some poor whale's gullet and explode the whale, and they're all just laughing, and I'm like sitting here going, that's not good. That was a perfectly nice little whale, and you just murdered it. And it's like, but no, you're in a different time, and that's the beauty of these books. It's like, wow, you were most definitely in a different time. So yeah, this is a book, like actually some older, well, for me, like, 50s or 60s or even 80s, kind of hard science fiction. You have stock characters. He's not, Pope is not interested in complex characters here. Hamilton himself is basically kind of just a vessel for the thing. His companion, Maori, fellow from New Zealand, John, speaks in kind of a pidgin English, which is pretty unfortunate. And everybody else is like, oh, I'm a noble prince, or oh, I'm an evil prince, and oh, I'm a beautiful, beautiful princess. So you're not really coming there for that. Strangely, by the end, I found it's like, oh God, he's launching into yet another essay here. But I by the end, he had kind of, Pope had kind of won me over to this of like, okay, we can't have a story that zips along like Edgar Rice Burroughs. We're like, nope, we're going to stop and we're going to have a whole description of vast caves with revivifying waters, or maybe it's because I'm all for I'm all for doing kind of these little detours that I was like, oh sure, fine, whatever. Now this book, which is over 500 pages long, it ends in a cliffhanger. You don't get the final story here. And, it ends in a cliffhanger. He's racing towards getting the casket out of the ship so he can go off for the rest of the stuff. Will Selima be saved? It still has time to quote Byron at length. Actually, each chapter has a quote from like Byron or Milton or Shakespeare or, various poets of the time. So that there's that added to the thing. And, it's funny. It's like, oh, okay, well, this is just his journal. But he's had time. I guess he has all these poetry just in his head that he could jot it down at the beginning of each chapter. So we get that, and we get trust in God at the end. Oh, and this is also speaking just from as a Canadian. Lieutenant Frederick Hamilton is an American. He's an American, and man, he tears up when they find the old Stars and Stripes, and they fly it on Mars, and they play the national anthem, and he's just like, oh, this is so awesome. And when it's like, oh, these American sailors, they'll be frightened like all the other sailors. It's like, no, they're American sailors. They could shake hands with old Nick. They're the best of the best. It's like there's, as a Canadian, we're just kind of like, oh yeah, it's an American who surprise, it's an American who thinks highly of America, and Americans. It's just like we Canadians should be like, nah. That's just another thing. It's like some things really changed, but other things, nope. America, they never change apparently. So yes, I will probably return for the sequel to this book that was published the next year in 1895. I don't know when I will. I read this as a PDF. It was a downloadable PDF hosted by Canadian Library, the Toronto Public Library. I'll put a link to it down below if you also want to read the PDF of Jrny Ta Mrs. But I will go on to Jrny to Venus, the primeval world, its wonderful creations and gigantic monsters, which, according to the science fiction encyclopedia site, is Hamilton visits a primitive Venus and shoots at anything that moves. So I expect to be again horrified by senseless butchery sold as daring do adventure. So yeah. That is my very long review of a very long book, but strangely, just I really enjoy going back in time in books like this, where you can see why maybe not. This isn't like everybody's reading this in the classroom or anything, but it's like this was really fascinating as a snapshot of again of these times, and also just of like yet again the Mars literature. The science fiction Mars literature that leads that Edgar Rice Burroughs springs out of. It's just that kind of cool thing of like, yeah, there's a whole kind of literature, whole kind of tradition of Mars stories before Edgar Rice Burroughs, and then from Edgar Rice Burroughs that carries out to science fiction of today, and how science fiction of today, like science fiction back then, reflects the attitudes and mores of the time. So, like, you know, like all literature does, but just from a different kind of angle. All right, more videos later.